Professor, as far as I understand, you're saying that as opposed to us following the ICC route, which has its roots in the Nuremberg trials, let's find an alternative. Is that what you say?
Well, what I'm saying is this. If our main objective is to stop the violence, we will not achieve it by targeting individuals who are in leadership positions in different cycles of violence. If we want to stop the violence, we have to realize that these individuals have a following. Individuals as awful and terrible as Bosco Ntaganda still have a large following. You remove them, you've done a Band-Aid operation. You still have to deal with issues which are the main reason why this following has been mobilized. It won't end the cycle of violence.
What about the concept of crime and punishment? That those who have committed the crimes must then be punished?
That's absolutely correct. But that is something that has to do with crime, criminal violence. I'm talking of political violence. Let's turn the question around. You look at cases of political violence around this continent, or look at cases of political violence around the world, and show me one example of where the violence has been ended by targeting individuals who are in leadership positions, by taking them to court. I can't think of any.
I can't think of any. But shouldn't leaders who are then leading, those violent incidents, shouldn't they take responsibility? Isn't it an issue of saying, well, if you lead Sudan in the process of certain crimes being committed, human rights violations and so on, then as a leader you must take responsibility?
Well, take the example of Sudan, which is very similar to the example of Kenya. Mm-hmm. The violence in Sudan was in Darfur. The violence in Kenya was in Rift Valley. In both cases, you had criminal gangs being used by leaders whose major ambition was political power. And in both cases, these leaders and these criminal gangs did not act alone, but they were actually able to mobilize large numbers of people. Large numbers of people got involved in the violence not because of pursuit of power, but they got involved in violence because they had real issues on the ground. The issue on the ground in both cases had to do with land. In Sudan, you had a drought going over 40 years. According to the UN Environmental Program, the Sahara had expanded southwards about 100 miles over 40 years, driving nomads of the north down south. As the nomads came down south, they were saying, we are Sudanese, we have a right to survive, and we have a right to land anywhere in Sudan. The peasants who lived around the mountain Jabal Mara were saying, no, you don't have a right, because this is our land, this is our tribal land. You had two different notions of land, same in Rift Valley in Kenya. In the Rift Valley, one group of people, the Kalenjin, were saying, this is our land because this has been our tribal land since colonial times. And another group, the Kikuyu, who had come down the mountains, were saying, this is our land because we have a market-based title to this land. Now, how are you going to deal with this situation? If you think that you can deal with this situation by targeting individual leaders, you are simply going to feed the cycle of violence. That is indeed what happened in Kenya. They targeted individual leaders on both sides, Uhuru Kenyatta on the Kikuyu side and William Ruto on the Kalenjin side. And then came the election. And in fact, what you did was you so polarized the politics of Kenya, you so completely ethnicized it, and you brought together these two people who had led opposing factions in the 2007 election and the violence that followed. They came together in the election, and lo and behold, they won the election. Now, what are you going to do?
So ultimately, it's that idea that no one is completely innocent, neither is there anyone who's completely guilty.
Well, the idea is this, look. In a court of law, the judge determines which of the two parties is innocent and which one is guilty. The court of law is a winner-take-all platform. In a civil war situation, especially where you have cycles of violence, the two sides, more often than not, trade sides. Today's victim may have been yesterday's perpetrator, and today's perpetrator, yesterday's victim. So that's the question. Is anybody wholly innocent? Is anybody wholly evil? The language of enemy is ill-suited to situations where you have a political conflict. And in my talk yesterday, I was really saying that let's look at actually, rather than looking at models which have been constructed by lawyers, let's look at what has happened on the ground, and let's identify situations and cases where we have managed to solve otherwise intractable political situations, and let's try and draw some lessons from it.
And one of those examples, according to your talk, is Codesa.
Yes, I think Codesa is a brilliant example of this, because, for several reasons. One is that, you see, in a Nuremberg type situation, a court is only possible where one side is won and the other side has been defeated. If there is not a victory, then it requires an external intervention, and therefore a victory engineered by this external intervention. Codesa gave us a real-life situation where, in fact, you had a stalemate. You had a stalemate with the apartheid state realized it couldn't win, and the liberation movements realized that there would be no revolution, and they were stuck with one another. And to find a way out of this dilemma, they could only do it by doing it together. If you criminalized either side, threatened to take them to court, then of course that side would have no motivation whatsoever to join in political discussions. You actually had to have a change of mindset. You had to think of the other side not as an enemy, because an enemy is somebody you wipe out. An enemy is somebody you eliminate. You had to think of them as adversary rather than enemy. With an adversary, you can talk. With an adversary, you can explore ways out of the situation. That's a big change of mindset. And what I was saying is that South Africa was not an exception. Before South Africa, you had the Ugandan case when the NRA, the National Resistance Army, came to power in 1986. And they had prevailed militarily in a very small part of the country, the Luero Triangle. But when they came to Kampala, the capital city, they realized that they didn't have political mobilization all over the country, and that they were in fact one amongst several groups. And they said they would create a broad-based government, meaning that every group with popular following of any sort would have representation in that government. They didn't have to give up their objectives. The only thing they had to give up was recourse to violence. And they created this broad-based government. Codesa was the next big example on the continent. Then followed Mozambique. You remember Mozambique with Renamo, which was a terrorist movement. Right? Renamo was openly terrorist, used terror as a propaganda tactic, and very similar to the LRA in Uganda. Right? And here you have a concrete demonstration of two different ways being followed. With Renamo, the way followed was a political way. The leadership of Renamo sits in parliament today, but the violence has ended. You can say that most of those leaders, in a court of law, they would have been convicted. You could say that the killers of Steve Biko, who were known killers, right, would have been hanged in any other situation. But that was the trade-off, right? The trade-off was the dead are dead. But the living must have a second chance.
Very important. The living must have a second chance. And and I suspect you're gonna get a lot of people calling in, and we'll open the lines in a minute, Prof. Will say, well, CODESA actually may have failed certain parts of the community. Who will say, and you point out in your speech, for instance, when you talk about the sunset clause and what it may have done in terms of the property rights and who benefited out of that. And people will say, where you don't have violence as we know it, where blood flows down the whatever, but you've got violence because certain people continue to be dispossessed in many ways.
Look, I'm in agreement with it. CODESA was not and could not be just the end of the story. It was a first step, a starting point in the journey out of apartheid. What CODESA did was it dismantled juridical and political apartheid. The task that remained was the task of dismantling the social effects of apartheid, what is often called social apartheid in this country, the immense disparity, economic disparity between the victims and the beneficiaries of apartheid. And my critique is not that could have been achieved then, because to expect that would have been to say that there should have been a revolution then. But CODESA took place precisely because there couldn't be a revolution. Then you couldn't say that there should have been a revolution, because that's wishful thinking. But the problem with CODESA was that it put a constitutional lid on the struggle for social justice. CODESA gave constitutional sanction to the property that had been to really theft, which had been translated into property under the apartheid eras. That was protected as a basic right under the new constitution, whereas the property of those whose land had been taken was not protected as a basic right, but simply given a mention in law. And my own view is that actually, while we recognize that these social wrongs, economic wrongs, could not have been corrected right then, but the journey could have begun. And that journey should have begun with the TRC.